And this is episode 35.
Yep, that's right.
So we've had, I think, a 3 week break this time.
Yeah, I was sick last week. And I mean, I was getting better, but not better enough, and I really needed to rest. So,
Yeah, good idea. And I had an episode once where we had to skip it because I had laryngitis. So these things
hmm
happen. So, yeah.
right, exactly. Yeah.
So I've got a few things to talk about. Democracy and politics, which I think kind of line up with one another,
hmm
and just some thoughts on education, actually,
Okay.
which I think is a big one. So.
All right. Well, what brings up democracy in particular here today?
Yeah, so actually, something happened. I actually can't recall what it was now. Something over the last week or so, and it just got me thinking about the state of democracy and so forth. And I thought it would probably be just a good thing to comment on. So there've been a few people. Pearl has said this. We've talked about this before. Pearl has said this,
hmm
and Janet Bloomfield previously. Janet Bloomfield used to be involved with A Voice for Men, but she had to retire from activism because her kids were threatened in the end. But both of them and quite a number of other people have argued against universal female suffrage. And as you know, I've previously discussed, I'm in favour of universal suffrage because I actually understand the arguments that are being made, and I think there's some arguments there that make some sense. But I think it's too dangerous to look at restricting suffrage at all.
Right.
Um,
Well, here's the problem with, and I've hinted this many times before when we've spoken about this subject, where the voting part is a bit of a red herring in this subject. It's basically the attitudes of women that need to be adjusted. That's the real part we need to actually be addressing. So, assuming, in the context that the vote is absolutely valid, then it's absolutely right that they do. But uh, what we're talking about is they have to vote for freedoms instead of against it, which I don't think they know what the distinction is nowadays. So.
That's a really good point, actually. So that actually comes down to education and to some extent culture as well. Yeah, that's a really good point, actually. I think you did actually briefly mention something like that once before, but I'm glad you brought that up.
Mhm.
Yeah, I mean the thing is the Winston Churchill. I don't know if I ever mentioned it. There's a quote that I really love. It's attributed to Winston Churchill. He says, "Democracy is the worst form of government except for all of the others." There's quite a few quite often quotes are attributed to individuals, and maybe, but I think in this case, I think this is something he actually said. So, yeah, it's democracy is not without its flaws. In fact, it's got plenty of flaws and short-term thinking and planning for the politicians just focused on the next election and so forth. These are issues we know about, but all of the others seem to have been worse in one way or another.
Basically, and it depends on what you mean by vote too. Like, it could just mean ballots, or it could just mean that people act accordingly in the market, kind of voting with their wallet, voting with who they choose to associate with, kind of like a voluntary interaction sort of context. So I think those distinctions are also kind of too important to not bring up.
Mhm. That's actually, again, a really good point. And it kind of leads into what I was going to say next, actually, is that democracy in the form that we have it hasn't been around for very long, 100, years in most jurisdictions. So, universal suffrage, I mean, we often see that, there's a lot of talk about, women not having the vote in previous centuries and so forth, but often very little discussion of the fact that men didn't have the vote either, or the vote was tied to land ownership, which could be, as we know from research that's been done, could be landowning women as well as landowning men. We know in the UK, for example, that landowning women definitely voted before men who didn't own land. But in terms of the universal suffrage we have at the moment, yeah, it's quite new. And my concern is that if we go down the wrong path, we might lose it, and it could end up being an historical footnote, as it were, if we're not careful. It's a lot of people seem to assume it's something that's enshrined in, it's a sort of uh, you know locked in stone, but it's really not. It could go. We could lose it if we're not careful.
Well, it's based on what you're saying. I think it's something that's taken for granted, basically, and what's also kind of similarly taken for granted. The I think and I blame the public school education for this for the most part, but I think that uh, when people speak of the freedom of the Western world, I think they're young people are taught that it's the freedom is about the vote, that democracy is the
Mm,
freedom. And I
mm,
think, and I'm vehemently against that sort of mindset,
mm,
basically.
mm,
Uh, uh, where voting is necessary, voting is a detail. It's a process. It's a tool within that freedom, but
mm,
it's not the
mm,
freedom itself. You know?
mhm.
Right? If that made
Yes,
sense.
I see where you're coming from. In actual fact, that brings up an aspect too that I have. I think I mentioned in one of my ICMI presentations actually that, as you say, it isn't just about voting. There's more to it than that. And one of the things that suffrage gives you is the recourse to politicians, where you can actually go and address and sort of talk to your local MP or whatever you happen to call them,
Hmm.
and raise issues with them. And I've personally done that actually, and
Hmm.
actually been surprisingly, it was actually quite surprisingly effective. I had a problem with a government department that dragged on for about 8 weeks, and I wrote my MP a letter addressing the problems. This is in Australia, and with 10 days from this is the day I wrote my snail mail letter and actually posted this, and this is sort of the 90s. 10 days from that, the problem was resolved. And then the problem had gone on for at least 8 weeks. So,
Hmm.
yeah, it's surprisingly effective, actually, and uh, in certain areas. But it's interesting that yes, this goes beyond merely voting, that it is that recourse to the system, as it were.
Hmm. Right.
Mm,
And here's how I want to address the recourse to the system as well.
mm,
Sometimes uh, there's a so the subject has come up in which you've got to vote something or else, basically,
mm,
which I take exception to because I think that uh, you know making recourse to the choices offered, there are no viable choices, but you're still being compelled to vote. I think protesting against that
mm.
and showing an abstention is in itself a vote.
Mm. Yes, and actually, you might. I don't. I think you probably know voting is compulsory here in Australia, whereas, of course, in most Western countries it is not. So you can go and spoil your ballot, as it were, but you don't get your name ticked off. But if you choose not to go and don't get your name ticked off, then you can actually be fined
It
for
sounds
not
like a
going.
useful bit of information to know when we're having debates and arguing about the vote, because
Yeah.
because sometimes in your case you're literally forced to waste your vote, basically. But
That's right.
yeah. But but if anything, I'm wondering if this should give some of you Australians a bit of an appreciation for the fact that maybe a vote of no, just an abstention might be something that can take the place that's good to have in place of an actual vote for nobody you want.
Yeah, and a certain percentage of people, no doubt, do spoil their ballots
Mhm.
deliberately. Yeah, increasingly, the major parties here appear to be indistinguishable, and the vote has been, in many elections, has been closer and closer to 50-50, as
Mhm.
people seem to be unable to distinguish between the two parties, and the vote is almost random at some points.
Right.
So this is quite a problem. We have a high voter turnout, of course, because it's compulsory, upwards of about 95%, which of course is extremely high compared to other Western
Mhm.
countries.
Right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
which are often in the 50 to 60% range, I think. But I've for a long time. I mean, the reason we do it in Australia is up because Australia had a very high. Well, First World War, Australia had a very high fatality rate and injury rate. I think higher than most other countries that were participating in the European theatre, for example. Uh, but that was the argument they put behind it, that because Australia had suffered so much in the First World War, that voting the franchise should be compulsory. And
Yeah.
Australia, by the way, was among the first countries that had universal suffrage for women. So this did, of course, include men and women at the time. But I've had more mixed feelings about it in recent years. For a long time, I was a supporter of universal suffrage, but the more I think about it in recent years, I thought, well, if people don't want to vote, that is, as you say, a choice in
Mhm.
itself. So
Yeah.
if somebody really doesn't want to go out and vote and doesn't think it's that important, well, who are we to really tell them they should?
And is that less important than people who just vote for the heck of it? They don't have any real stake in matters.
Mm,
They just kind of
mm,
going by their favorite proverbial sports team,
mm.
if
And
that
they may
makes sense.
be yeah, they may be more careless actually in
Hmm.
terms of how they vote because they didn't really care about it. Perhaps it'd be better if they did stay away.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Like I remember back in the 2000, oh, what the heck was it? 2000, it's not 2008, it's 2000, um maybe it was 2012. Yeah. Yeah, that's in the United States. Obama
Mm.
versus Mitt Romney, basically. And
Mhm.
when Obama was elected, uh college kids, like those well-to-do college girls are all like, thanks for not voting racism. When
Yeah,
when Obama was voted, in praise of Obama, of the situation, they went, thanks for not voting racism.
yeah, yeah.
Right. So you're not racist if you vote for Obama, but you are if you voted for Romney,
Yeah,
basically.
yeah,
Right.
which is
Yeah.
awful. And this comes back to the growing intolerance we're seeing in Western civilization, intolerance for alternative viewpoints. I mean, just because somebody has a different viewpoint than you doesn't make them a racist, and it doesn't make them evil. Perhaps they're coming from a different place, they've had different life experiences, perhaps they've got different aims.
Mm.
But yeah, they may well their vote may be as well thought out as your vote is. But we
Hmm.
don't see that at all. Increasingly in the West, we're seeing this intolerance from both sides.
Yeah, I see it. Yeah.
Mm.
Mm.
I think we're seeing that all across the West. So unfortunately. So that's probably the main areas I wanted to talk about on democracy, although it does link in a little bit to the discussion. I just want to sort of add a few points briefly about politics,
Yeah.
which
Yeah.
is
Yeah.
we've touched on a little bit. And in fact, it actually goes back to what you were saying before about really this being about changing the way that people are approaching it and
Hmm.
perhaps encouraging women to vote differently if they're if you know
Yeah.
perhaps having a broader understanding of certain issues and so forth.
Yeah.
One of the interesting things that we're seeing is that and this is particularly from the US is of course that women used to vote more conservatively than men in the US, and I think that's true in other countries too, but not to the same extent. Up until about 1980, I think women were voting more conservative than men in the US. I think in the 1980 presidential election, it was about equal and congressional
You,
election. And then
you mean
afterwards,
you mean like socially conservatively?
yes, yes, exactly. Yeah, more than economically. Yes, absolutely. That's right.
Well, yeah. I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah.
well, while the men were out fighting World War II, the women stayed and voted in prohibition of all things. So,
Well, earlier, was that earlier? World War One? Prohibition would have been
well, yeah. Sure, sure. I'm
2020s.
probably,
Yeah,
yeah, I'm
yeah,
probably
yeah,
getting my wars
yeah,
mixed up here because there are
yeah,
so many.
yeah.
Yeah.
But yes, exactly. That's right. And there was, I think it's pretty well established in the US that women were more conservative than men,
Mhm.
at least yeah, socially, up
Right.
until about 1980, and after that it started to change. And of course, there's some recent data that I saw that shows that women as a group are swinging to the left. Men to the are going to the right, but not nearly as much as the women are
Mhm.
swinging to the left. And that's also more pronounced in the United States than other countries. We're seeing it in every country, at least every Western country, but it seems to be particularly prevalent in the US. And yes, I think this comes down to a broader education of the issues and uh, more willingness to accept alternative viewpoints and explore the issues, I think.
Right. Well, yeah, and it's not just that the education is failing per se. It is, but it's just kind of making a gear towards pandering to women, basically. So, yeah, so it's more, the problems are more of proactive things than a failure to do certain things.
Actually, that reminds me too that in the US, well, women are a majority of the electorate in the US, and then so they're more likely to vote than men, as well as being a slight majority of the population. They're also more likely to vote than men. But that's probably something about compulsory voting in Australia that we wouldn't have that so much, perhaps. But yeah, they do. They are, of course, the majority of the electorate, and it does seem to be that yes, we very much see politicians, particularly well, male politicians, pandering to women as a group because women also are more likely to vote more similarly than men are too, and that's of course goes down to that. Of course, comes back to male variability where men are more likely to be dissimilar from one another than women are. So it follows that women will be more likely to vote in the same way as a group than men would. So I think it's natural probably for politicians to do this because it is in their best interest to do so. But of course, it is part of the problem.
Well, yeah, yeah. I mean, you know, I both despise and do not envy politicians, basically, because they're public property, or at least they
Mm.
have to be public property in order to kind of be a successful politician. So, um, part of me loathes them for that, but part of me, uh, feels inordinately sorry for them.
Dare I say a necessary evil?
Well, how necessary really is it, you know? I mean,
Yeah.
I mean, were it that a politician could get away being totally honest and then getting followers based on that and votes based on that and then following through on his promises, like I think such things are rare. Though Javier Milei, I think he's doing a fantastic job right now. I did not expect such brilliance coming from from a politician, and it's not even in the
Right.
United States. So
Yeah. Yeah.
I like him. I like him a lot.
Yeah. There've been a couple of cases of governments, and from a libertarian point of view, I think you probably find interesting too. There've been a couple of cases of governments that have been in basically a state of deadlock for an extended period of time.
Hmm.
And so no new initiatives. They've basically been in what we call caretaker mode, where the government has to tick along and make decisions as required, but no new initiatives. And if there's an emergency and they need to act, they need to consult with the opposition and so forth. Belgium had one, I think, for about 10 months or something.
Hmm.
And Israel had one actually for quite an extended period of time, pre-October 2023. This was going back a few more months, but they had an extended period. They actually had about 5 or 6 elections, 4 or 5 elections. So they're in caretaker mode for a long time. But what's interesting is in both cases, the economy actually seemed to be doing quite well
They
without
always do
government
better, right?
without
Like
government intervention.
like I think Americans are some of the most inordinately stupid people when it comes to this kind of thing. They're absolutely whipped because back in 2013, I think it was, or was it? Yeah, 2013, like a later part of it. Uh, so everybody was freaking out about the government shutdown, right?
Mhm.
Which
Mhm.
didn't last for days. I think it was. It was so insignificant. I don't even remember the details. But the people I was there was with. I was in kind of like some kind of programming training thing in Fairfax, Virginia at the time. I don't know, maybe it's because we're so close to Washington D.C. that everything's kind of seemed kind of stupid. But beside the point. Um, I heard one guy said while there was this freak out about government shutdown was that if we have if the government was shut down for 3 days, we will lose the United States will lose food 3 days after. That's what the person sincerely believed.
Right, but in actual fact, the government is not the one conveying that food at all.
No, it's like the stupidest thing
Mm.
I've ever heard.
It'd be all private enterprise, yeah.
Right, sure, like we'll probably have more food. Yeah. Mhm.
Yeah, that's right. There'd be government services that wouldn't be available and so forth. But yes,
Yeah.
food production would go on and food transportation would go on because that's all in the hands of
Right.
private
It's
enterprise. Yeah.
yeah, it's stupid. Like the fear mongering about this absolute terror of having no government is just unbefitting to a country like the United States.
Mm. It's interesting actually. Yeah, from the idea of the government shutdowns you have in the US, they're quite sort of alien to us, I suppose, as people would say, using a Westminster system, looking from the outside. We had something like that in Australia in 1975, and it was an absolute crisis here because it was a big deal because it was the only time it had ever happened. But it seems like the US has had a few, so it's interesting to watch sort of what happens from the outside.
What was the crisis? I mean, was Australia so dependent that
Okay.
nothing actually ran? Sorry, I'm taking a bit of shot at you guys, but
Oh, I'm glad you asked. I'm glad you asked. The Australian 1975 Australian constitutional crisis. For anybody who really wants it, there's about a 4 or 5 hour documentary that was, miniseries that was made a few years later. I watched it. I
okay.
enjoyed it. A lot of people would probably find it fairly boring, but I enjoyed it. Basically, a bit of terminology. The supply is the terminology given to passing the budget. So if supply is blocked, that means the budget doesn't pass, which is basically the equivalent of a government shutdown. So in 1970, Australia has 2 houses of parliament. The Australian government, it's essentially we modelled our system on the US system to a large degree. At least it's within the Westminster system, lots like the UK, but they took a lot of influence from the American system. So we have the House of Representatives and the Senate, just like you do. And in many ways, the powers are similar, and that's because they actually had copies of the US Constitution at Australia's Constitutional Convention. So it was about 100 years later, and they looked at the US Constitution, they looked at what they had, what had worked and what hadn't worked, they felt, and basically based it on that. So a system is fairly similar. The opposition controlled the Senate in 1975, which is actually not that unusual in Australia for the two different parties to control the two houses. And the supply had to go through the Senate, and the opposition blocked supply. And so this ended up causing a deadlock in the government. And there were a whole bunch of things that were tried to resolve this, negotiations and so forth, and the opposition stood firmly. And what happened next is where you get to the point of it being a constitutional crisis. So the basically the Prime Minister, who's the head of government, see in Australia and in Westminster countries, the head of government and the head of state are separate, whereas in the United States, of course, they're in one. So basically what happened was, as a result of this back and forth, the I think from memory, the Prime Minister was concerned about the Governor General, who's actually the King as the head of state, the Queen at the time. But the Governor General acts in that role because the monarch is over in the UK. So for all practical purposes, the Governor General is really doing this role. The Prime Minister had concerns about the Governor General, was going to ask the Queen to terminate the Governor General's commission, which is basically fire the Governor General. The Governor General, meanwhile, was very concerned about supply being blocked and spoke to the leader of the opposition privately, which the Prime Minister says maintained is not allowed without, basically the Prime Minister has to okay that, but he didn't okay it. So the leader of the opposition and the Governor General were talking, and the Governor General said to the leader of the opposition, if I make you the Prime Minister, will you agree to pass supply? Because remember, they were the ones blocking it. And will you call an election within 3 months? I think it was 3 months. Mm-hmm. And the leader of the opposition agreed to these terms. And so the Governor General terminated the commission of the Prime Minister, i.e. fired the Prime Minister, which is within the realm of power of the Governor General. But the manner in which it was done was a problem, because basically you had a situation where it looked like the Prime Minister and the Governor General were going to fire each other. Mm. And what happens then? So this is where the constitutional crisis came about. And anyway, the Governor General got in first, terminated the Prime Minister's commission, appointed the leader of the opposition as the Prime Minister, and the election was called within 3 months, which I seem to recall the same party, the opposition, was returned in government. But a lot of people were very unhappy about how it happened. And anyway, so that was the Australian constitutional crisis, and it was something that even other Westminster countries took a great deal of interest in, because it could potentially have happened in their own countries, and the fact that it was really the manner in which the Prime Minister his commission was terminated by the Governor General. But the Governor General, I believe, always maintained he'd done the right thing, and Gough Whitlam, who was the Prime Minister who was fired, famously came out and said, God save the Queen, because nothing will save the Governor General, because basically he knew the Governor General would get a lot of hate, and the Governor General ended up leaving Australia and living overseas afterwards. Okay. Because of what happened. Yeah. So basically that was the Australian constitutional crisis of 1975. The only time we've had one. Australian politics is generally very boring. I hope that all made sense. Anyway, that was a very quick overview. I hope that made sense.
Yeah, sure, it made sense, but it's funny that that is the crisis. That's
yeah. Yeah. When I went to Canada, one of the things they said to me when I first arrived there is they said, you'll find Canadian politics is very boring. And of course, that's a good thing. And it's true. And so is Australian politics, by and large.
Well, I don't know if Canadian politics is boring nowadays. I think it's kind of like hell right now.
Actually, that was 20 years ago, more than 20 years ago. So maybe, yeah, it's exactly. Yeah. Yes.
Oh, yeah. And now they're really cracking down the hate speech, the so-called hate speech.
Actually, you are right. Yeah. Yes, mm-hmm. Yes. In fact, a lot's changed, actually. I left 12 years ago, and and a lot has changed in that time. It's actually really quite concerning, some of the stuff that's going on in Canada. Yeah. Mm-hmm. fact, that's probably a good one for another episode, actually.
It's probably something worth noting, be sure.
Yeah, absolutely. So, yes, democracy and politics. And one point I want to just make pertaining to something that I mentioned earlier, and I was talking about how you could go to your MP and how effective I found it to be. I did mention briefly, depending on what sort of what area you're approaching them with, it only works if in certain areas, because we know, for example, that there are problems, say, with the family courts, and we don't see these sort of solutions working with these sort of problems. But there are other areas where it can work. But yeah, of course that's part of the problem with democracy too. Of course, politics is downstream from culture, and that's what, of course, what we're doing at A Voice for Men. We're really trying to get the
Yeah.
people to see the problem, so that politicians will see the problem.
Yeah, sure. And expect more articles from me about changing the cultural narrative for sure. I know I've been taking a
Excellent.
break from all that kind of stuff because well, life is busy. It's not because I had like problems or anything like that. Things have been busy. Also, I've been sick this past 2 weeks or something like that. I'm just only now getting better. But I want to tackle things like why bending the knee is not good for men.
Mm,
And other things because bending the knees, that's like intrinsic to relations between men and women because
mm.
have you not noticed men are always down on their knees for women in order to have a relationship with them, you know.
The whole idea of proposing on your knee always struck me as really strange, even as a
Mhm.
child. Yeah,
Right.
and you see pictures of people of men literally doing it. I just think it's absolutely extraordinary that anyone would
well
would do that.
well, and they go out of the way to make it a show too, like people do it
Mhm,
purposely in front of others for others to watch,
mhm, mhm.
and it's just
Yes.
right. Yeah. And not to say I'm taking the woman's side on this thing, but of course it puts some weird pressures on. I'm not being a gynocentrist here. I'm just making kind of
Mhm,
like an argument from the other side too. You know, uh,
mhm.
you know, if everybody's watching, how are you supposed to respond, kind of a thing. Right, right.
Yes, yes, social
Yes,
pressure.
yeah.
Yep,
Yes, sir,
yep,
absolutely. No, this is
yeah,
not gynocentrism. This is
yeah, yeah,
not
yeah.
me trying to suck up to the woman in any case, whatever. I'm just saying this is just a part of the thing that no one seems to really address. I guess women kind of really like the idea of men on their knees too much for this to ever be brought up, I suppose.
It's a
So
good point, though. I've seen a few proposals on, say, TV or that sort of thing, or in front of a large crowd, and you think, of course, she's going to say yes in front of the crowd or on TV, because everybody's hoping for the best outcome, that
mhm.
positive outcome,
Right,
and
yeah,
so yeah, yeah, it's quite
yeah.
odd, yeah.
Yeah. So I'm gonna do a bit of a revision of what I just said. Like women should be more personally accountable, and maybe not say yes because you're the one that's going to screw him over anyway. So
But it's as you say, though, in that public forum,
mhm.
everybody virtually expect a lot of, and people are affected by social pressure. So even if
Right, yeah,
even if it's not what she really wanted, she's probably going to say yes in the public
yes.
eye.
I'm going to be a flagrant individualist, sit here and say screw the public. Like handle things privately. You know,
Yeah,
um,
yeah, it
you
should be
know,
done
you
privately.
know, give it intimacy, real meaning. I don't mean romantic love. I mean
Mm,
like actual like person to person things. Those things are what really makes civilization, not the public.
mm,
So right, yeah, the non-interference, the lack of scrutiny from others is what is the actual virtues of civilization. The the public involvement and like the lack of privacy is not. That is savagery. That is just
mm,
downright barbarism. It's qualities of tribe. I ain't going
mm.
on a rant here. Come on, Rob, stop me. Come on, like let's move on to the next subject.
Well, while you were talking, it was actually reminding me of something that I listened to over the last week or so. Thomas Sowell. Now, I'm a bit of a geek about
Mhm.
history and
Yeah,
economics and science and whatever, right?
yeah.
Uh, for some reason, I only found out about Thomas Sowell about 3 years ago. I don't know how I managed to miss him for so long,
Yeah,
because
yeah. Seriously, how did you manage to miss him of all people? Come on now.
I don't know, because it's funny, because but a lot of people are saying they've only just discovered him, so it's not just me. So he's been famous since the 1970s, right?
Yeah, yeah,
But
yeah.
yeah, or perhaps I saw him on TV and I didn't know his name, or whatever, and
Yeah,
know all
he's
the things.
spoken with
Yeah,
Milton Friedman, Walter
yeah.
Williams. He's been around.
Yeah, exactly. So anyway, I've been listening to some audiobooks of his, and he's got, I don't necessarily agree with everything he says, but he's got lots of great ideas. And one interesting idea that he was talking about, though, was about, and I've been thinking along similar lines too, in terms of trust in society, and how I think one of the things I plan to do down the road with the Voice for Men is more start to talk more about that sort of thing, about integrity and so forth, and how I really encourage men to show integrity, because this is something we used to have, particularly, I can't necessarily say for every civilization, but in terms of Western civilization, there was really a focus on integrity and so forth, and honesty, and it's something that he was pointing out has been lost. And this sort of helped to reaffirm ideas that I had been thinking about for a while. He gave an interesting example of restaurants. This predates me. This goes back to the 1960s, because
Hmm.
Thomas is 95 now or something, so he's been around for quite a while.
Oh
But he was
yeah, he
talking
is
about
old.
restaurants that were in the 1950s and 60s and earlier,
Mhm.
and apparently you would just go get the food, and you select it yourself, and then I think you didn't even take it to the counter. You just told them what you'd purchased, and they rang it up, and you paid the money. And he said that they started to disappear in the 1960s, and by the 1970s, all of these restaurants, all these places were gone, and that it
Right,
was
yeah.
the yeah, and that people were being watched as they were purchasing the food. And he put this down to this lack of integrity, or integrity and honesty being deprioritized in Western
Exactly,
civilization.
right, yeah.
And this is something I've been thinking about myself for quite a while, and something at a Voice for Men I'll be encouraging men to be honest,
Hmm.
and to show integrity and so forth. And this is something I think as a society we need more of.
Right, yeah, and I 100% agree with this one. But not to take away from what you just said, but when you talked about integrity, people just told you the restaurant what they ate and was
Mm.
charged on that basis. It reminded me, sorry, it reminded me of a Three Stooges sketch, a scene from it. Basically, when the
Okay.
when the Three Stooges were running a restaurant, right, and Larry was uh writing down what the guy had written based on the stains of food on his uh, his necktie. Yeah, chicken stew, tenderloin steak, and coffee. Is that all? Custard pie.
Nice.
Yeah, yeah. I think the episode was playing the ponies. It's the one where
Okay.
they sell the restaurant for a bad horse, but they have to get the horse to win. It's one of my favorite
Right.
sketches,
Right. I don't know if I've
sketches.
seen that one actually. Yeah.
That's a
I've had
great one. Yeah, it's the one where they feed the horse peperinos and make him run fast.
timeless humor.
Hmm.
Yes. So yes, I encourage everyone to read Thomas Sowell as well. I think
Hmm.
he's got. In fact, he has an interesting take too on certain cultural areas in the US, particularly in the South in the US. And he's
Hmm.
talking. He's actually saying that certain cultural traits in that area actually came from Northern England, and he could track it to basically where people had come through from different areas in England when settling in the United States. And you could see that more people from Northern England had settled in the southern US, for example, and certain cultural traits had come through.
Sure.
Anyway,
Yeah.
I won't spoil the fun, but it's a really interesting. That's another one of the interesting audiobooks. I don't recall the title of that one,
Right.
unfortunately.
Yeah. Absolutely. Sure. Yeah. And I want to make a point here that I'm not for in any way saying that uh you know American greatness came out of nowhere, or rather that it was just purely an American thing. It obviously came from the people that came to America. It's
Yeah,
it's like so
yeah.
this sense of individualism. And that's what America is properly based on, by the way, is individualism, and I will die on that hill. Is that you know the potential is everywhere. Like west,
Mm.
east, it doesn't really matter. That's the
Yes,
spirit that
yes,
is that really matter. It transcends cultures, so we can't
yes.
rely too much and ride on the coattails of the idea of culture so much that it comes from this or this is the birthplace of this or so. I mean, America at least should be the big bastion for it, of course, but it doesn't mean that it's a uniquely American phenomenon. Because you know I remember back in the protests in Hong Kong happening, a lot of these people are more like made me envious of their American spirit more than I was seeing the Americans uh, at the time as well.
Pride
And
in pride in their country, and wanting to make the country better than it is.
exactly, yes,
Yeah,
yeah.
something that seems to
Mhm.
that seems to have disappeared from the West within my lifetime, actually,
Right.
probably in the
Yeah.
last 20 to 30 years. Another aspect of that I wanted to mention, actually, which was something you reminded me of just then, is I think colonial societies tend to be because colonization self-selects for motivated people. You've got to be motivated to migrate, essentially. And
Yeah.
having
Yeah.
migrated between countries myself, and
Hmm.
I know you've moved between countries too, that it takes a certain get up and go to do it, right?
Hmm.
And I think that the type of people who people joke about Australia being settled by convicts, right? People who
Yeah.
involuntarily went there. In actual
Hmm.
fact, that's only a small proportion of the population. And even in the early days, it wasn't all of them. For the first few years, it was most of them. But it quickly actually
Yeah.
became a minority quite quickly. But
Right.
what's I mean, these days in Australia, people are proud to have a convict ancestor. Actually, it's a bit of a thing now. But I do think that motivation, you got to get up and go to move to another place. You obviously have also got to get up and go to make something of yourself. And I do think that the settler countries or the colonized countries, the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, there are others, they they have a lot of get up and go
Hmm.
because they are selecting for people who have that capacity by virtue of the fact you've got to get there and you've got to have that get up and go to be able to find yourself in that new country and make a go of it. There isn't. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, and then I have one other point I
Well,
wanted to make.
I got a big question about that. So
Yeah.
so this idea of get up and go and
Mm,
make yourself something out of it, which I 100% believe. So does
mm.
that make a distinction between the immigrants of back then, like say to America maybe, and what's passing off as immigration today in the form of illegal uh, coming in? Like I kind of want to make this like I've been having
Yes.
questions about about the question of borders, closed or open, that sort of thing. Do you have any thoughts on that one then?
Okay, so migrating in the 19th century or even the early 20th century would have been a much bigger deal than migrating now. I mean, I migrated in the 21st century, but I knew that I could pick up the phone and talk to my family in Australia anytime I wanted. I could, within a few years, I could do. It was early 21st century when I did it, but after a few years, video calling was pretty common and so forth. So I'm not as isolated from my family as somebody who migrated in say the 19th century would have been, and also too I'm coming to an industrialized country which is a standard of living similar to the place I've come from in my case, and in the case of other immigrants it might be better than what they came from. So I would say that it's not as hard to migrate now as it would have been in the 19th century when if you say moved from the UK to Australia and you would have been moving to a wilderness or to the US a few decades earlier, same thing. It would have been a lot harder. The standard of living, perhaps at least briefly, would temporarily would have been lower, and I do think it would have been a lot harder. So that's not to say that skilled migration. I think the Western countries are benefiting a great deal from skilled worker migration, for example, at the moment, which is different from open borders, of course,
Hmm.
but uh, but it would have been a lot harder. We everything's like that's easier now.
Right,
And
exactly. Yeah.
it took me
Yeah, yeah,
24 hours, yeah, not 2 months too.
yeah, sure. So is it proper to kind of distinguish immigration, and that is to say legal, as
Yes.
basically more proper assimilation and more like an actual directed effort to becoming an American, as opposed to what's kind of amounting to pillaging, basically. Is that
Well,
does that make sense?
do you mean like multiculturalism where you effectively have people coming in but essentially can stay
Yeah,
in their
yeah.
own communities? Yeah.
And
Um,
basically, yeah, like what's kind of going on now in the United States, basically, just this kind of influx of what people call immigrants, but it seems to be just kind of like you know just Biden, for example, kind of just letting people in and letting them have at it, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting looking from the outside in. I lived in Canada, I lived in Australia. I've been to the US many, many times. I just spent a month there. I've never lived there. So I'm looking from the outside in. I find it's absolutely extraordinary the tolerance that the US has for illegal immigrants. We don't have that tolerance here, and there
Hmm.
isn't that tolerance in Canada either. but certainly Australia certainly absolutely does not have that tolerance. I mean, we're surrounded by water, right? So that helps.
Right. Yeah.
But yeah, but you just, I mean, I think I've heard figures like 12 million illegals in the US, and that's just extraordinary. Even proportionally, we have nothing like that here. Uh, there's nothing like catch and release here at all. You don't, even if somebody's found to be illegal, I mean, in Australia, all police officers are immigration officers, right? So if a police officer comes across someone who they reasonably believe have breached their visa conditions,
Hmm.
they will detain them under the Immigration Act and hand them over to the Department of Immigration. Now, what the Department of Immigration then does is up to them. So they may expel them, they may issue them some sort of visa class or whatever they happen to choose to do, but that person is off the streets and in the system. And I think I've mentioned before, I'm a former Queensland police officer, and I can tell you during my service as a police officer, I did detain people under the Immigration Act.
Okay.
On one particular occasion, I recall I came across a young man. It was a situation where two men were in an intimate relationship and domestic violence had occurred. And it came to my attention during the matter that the younger man had actually breached his visa conditions. So I detained him under the Act and he was sent over to immigration. I don't know what happened after that.
Right.
But that's how we do it in Australia. And the idea that the US would be so casual about it, it's just to me it's extraordinary.
Mm.
I've known about it for a long time, and I still don't I still don't understand it or really get it.
Right. Exactly. Yep.
Yep, yep. I mean, it's every Western country has sort of a group of people who do jobs that nobody else wants to do. Like for Australia, it's working holiday visa people
Hmm.
because we have people from all over the world who want to come here and be on working holiday visas. So the same is true in New Zealand and Canada to a certain extent. There are various countries that have other groups of people. I think in the US, it's pretty much illegals who are doing a lot of this work. So I would suggest the US should sort out its system, tighten up immigration, and that's not to say, as I'm quite pro-immigration in terms of
Mm.
bringing in the right people,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. 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 Of
I
course.
myself am an
Same.
immigrant. I went to another country, right?
Absolutely.
Um, and I've got other immigrants in my family and so forth. So, but it has to be legal immigration, and it has to be a system that is fair and gets the right people into the country. So, a certain number of refugees plus the skilled workers your country needs. That's my view.
Hmm. Right. Yeah. That's definitely understandable. Yep. Yeah. I think that that distinction between the open borders and like discussion of immigrants is kind of not well communicated. It's not well educated at this point. To kind of
Yeah,
it's rather conflated, and it's something I've kind of like had to kind of rack my brain over for a bit too. Yeah, to be sure.
yeah. Yeah, open borders is an interesting, idea. Is anyone in the US seriously suggesting the border with Mexico should just be open? I mean, I know it is probably de facto open at the moment in many ways,
Well,
but they don't want to make that de jure.
well,
Uh,
there are those uh, generally in the SJW side that are kind of
yeah.
like the elimination of borders as such, basically.
Yes,
I
fair
mean, I
enough.
mean,
Good point.
yeah, they're probably the same people who say that, like I saw this a lot in Minnesota, by the way,
Mhm.
signs on their house and their houses lawns that say all are welcome here.
So
Do
I
they
just
really
like to
mean
say,
that? So,
I just like to say Minnesota, far from the southern border.
well, yeah, exactly. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
right. Yeah, yeah,
Uh, yeah, that's interesting. Okay, so yeah, so SJWs make sense, but I would imagine
right.
that
Yeah.
it's probably a minority, small minority. At least I hope it's a small minority.
I, I, I I can't speak to that. And it's like
Okay.
because the American left is probably against those borders. The right is probably borders for them. There's a big
Yeah.
split in the libertarian movement because some kind of argue more for the freedom of movement, while others take more on that, like a hard stance on that. So
Yes.
it's undeterminate when it comes to the libertarian side. There's a debate
Yes.
going on.
Yes.
It's absolute. I think
Yeah.
so that hence why I'm kind of like really mulling this thing over. I'm uh, at the moment against the open border situation, but
Mm.
but at the same time, like you said, pro proper immigration, and
Yes.
I
Yes.
think and once again, I think that the discussion is conflated. It's basically kind of mixing the two concepts together and making
Yeah.
arguments on behalf of the other where it doesn't apply. So I think
Yeah.
this is something that I kind of want to have a better stance on before I speak more on it. But I
In
think
actual fact, I was on the topic of open borders, actually, such as they are, if two countries have a roughly same economic opportunities,
Mhm.
then you may well be able to free up immigration, not necessarily open the borders, but you may be able to free up movement between those two countries and
Right,
not
yeah,
have people pouring one way or the other. A good example, there are a couple of probably good examples, the European Union, of course, which is interesting because there is actually quite a bit of economic disparity in the European Union, and they do see a lot of people moving from Eastern Europe to Western Europe.
hmm
Australia and New Zealand, I don't know if you know, have an agreement called the Trans-Tasman Travel Arrangement.
okay,
And as an aside, I'll tell you something. I put the Wikipedia article on that topic up. I wrote this. I wonder what the agreement was called, and I dug around and I found an Australian government site, a very obscure Australian government site that referred to the Trans-Tasman Travel Arrangement. I put the article on Wikipedia. I don't remember what year I did this. Quite a way back, maybe 20 years ago or something. And after that, I noticed the term started appearing more often in journalism and among journalists and so forth, and not
okay,
people use the term now. And I do think if you put an article in Wikipedia, it does tend to drive sort of adoption of the term.
right, yeah,
But anyway, yeah. But anyway, so yeah, I actually put that original article in, and of course it's been greatly expanded now. But this agreement between Australia and New Zealand says that as long as you don't have a criminal record, and you're reasonably healthy, you're not going to be a drain on the health system. You are able to go sort of a presumption. It's not a right, but it's a presumption that you can move and work and live in the other country. And this has proven, I think it's proven to be beneficial to both countries because what they found is that there's a group of people, mostly New Zealand citizens actually, but some Australians as well, that essentially move backwards and forwards between the two countries based on the relative prosperity. So if the New Zealand economy picks up, they'll move back to New Zealand. If the Australian economy picks up, they'll move to Australia. And this, of course, promotes labour mobility, which modern economic theory says
hmm
is a good thing. So I think under the right circumstances, it's a good thing and can work. But it has to be where the relative economic prosperity between the two countries is relatively balanced,
hmm
such that you're not getting economic migrants, you're getting people who are looking to improve their situation,
right, yeah,
and they've got the get up and go to do it. And then,
hmm
as I said, that's the studies that have been done have suggested that there's sort of the same people are the ones who tend to move backwards and forwards between Australia and New Zealand. So, and there are a few other examples around Ireland and the UK is another one actually with the common travel area. So there are a few examples, but it only works because they're relatively similar levels of economic wealth.
yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. So I mean, Canada and the US could potentially be one that might work. Some economists and
Yeah,
others have been surprised that there isn't more liberal movement. But as someone who's lived in Canada, Canadian citizen, and I know a lot of other Canadian citizens and Americans, and I can tell you that if there are a lot who live in each other's countries.
yeah, right,
Yeah. So if you're a Canadian, you want to go to the US, there are options, and vice versa.
hmm right,
Yeah.
yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. And the other thing I wanted to say too is that about the politics in the US and views on immigration. I think there is a tendency for a lot of people to assume it's fairly polarized with the parties. But I do not lived in North America, got family in the US, do know a lot of Americans across the political spectrum, and I can tell you that I personally know Democrats who are very unhappy with the current situation on the border.
Got it. Yeah,
So
sure. Yeah.
yeah, I think that's something that perhaps is being lost in the message, but they're out there. I don't know if they're a minority, maybe they are, but there are definitely people who are vote Democrat, and some perhaps are even in the party, and they are not happy with the current
I
situation.
wonder if this has something to do with towing the party line and not really making it too open about the about one's true feelings, I suppose.
So
Like,
they might not be too vocal about it, so you don't hear about it, sort of thing.
yeah, sure. Like I'm kind of reminded of some who might have sympathy towards men's issues but don't dare speak of it. You know,
Yes, that's another good point. Yeah,
it's kind of
yes,
like
and I guess that's
remember what I
that's
said
where you
about
need.
not envying politicians. This is part
Yeah,
of it. Yeah, I
yeah.
don't, and I would not be a politician for this reason.
And this is where people, yeah, I guess need to stand up and if they believe in that party and they care about that party, then I think they need to stand up and say, okay, we're doing this wrong, and we need to at least bring it back a little bit and stop being so extreme on this issue or that issue, or whatever it happens to be.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So hopefully we will hear more people being more vocal then in the Democratic Party in the future.
Exactly. Yeah. Right. Yeah. And not that this has anything to do with what we just spoke about, but it kind of brought to mind, like, speaking of parties, like, there's at least been two uh Republican women actually coming out against infant male genital mutilation as of late. I've been kind of seeing that, and I'm just kind of I suppose pleasantly surprised that it's coming from the Republican side, because you know you
Mm.
kind of assume that the conservative types will be more for
Yeah.
preserving that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So yeah, like
Yeah.
yeah,
I do think we're certainly seeing a change.
yeah,
I think year on year we do see a move towards a move away from some of the more extreme views that we have been seeing and towards more sensible views. In fact, on the case of MGM, it's actually the rate in the US is actually declining, and I think it's actually starting to decline fairly quickly. So, I
Hmm.
mean, the same thing happened in Australia a few decades ago. Australia used to have quite a high rate of circumcision, and I think it was partly modelled on the US, and a lot of American servicemen were here during World War II, and I think they had something of an influence on the culture. And I haven't verified this, but I suspect that's when circumcision became common in Australia and in and after World War II. And it was still still pretty common up until the 1970s. But after the 1970s, it started to decline to the point where only about 10% of boys go through routine infant circumcision now in Australia. And no, I notice recently that the rate in the US seems to be declining,
hmm,
and I just seem to be moving in the right direction.
absolutely, sure. And I can't remember the name of one of them. They're on Twitter, but like something Phillips, I think it was, is one of them. But the other one that figures prominently, I think Gary Costanza had like a article put on Voice for Men recently with a video, like a New Hampshire representative. I think her name's
I
Ellen
remember that.
Reed. Yeah, right,
Yes.
right. And and,
Right.
and I think that she came out against circumcision. Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
right. So those are some good signs, you know.
Yes.
Right, yeah, sure. I'm a very greedy person. I think it's not happening fast enough, but still, like, take what you can get.
I absolutely agree. That's right.
Yeah,
That's right. I'm a pragmatist though, and I say I'd like it to be faster. I'd like it to be illegal, but at least it's moving in the right direction.
for sure.
Yep.
Yep.
Yep. I'm not an optimist by nature actually, and I do think that on a lot of the issues we talked about, excuse me,
Mhm.
that we are moving in the right direction. I've been doing this about 11 or 12 years now, and in that time I've seen a lot of change, and I do think we're moving in the right direction. And we know some people and who I think were quite pessimistic a few years ago about whether they'd ever see significant change. And even those people I've noticed have started to say, yeah, I think
Right. Yeah.
actually things are going the right way. So it's slow, not fast enough, like you say, but I do think we're going in the right direction. Societies,
Absolutely.
I think what we're doing is actually working. We just talk about these issues and people are hearing it. And I do think, yeah, over the next few years, I think we'll see even more significant change.
Yeah. Let's keep on living to see it. Right.
Exactly.
Yeah. Sure. Yeah. Before we forget, like, you had something about education, unless you had something more on those.
No, no. So I think that's all probably on democracy and politics. I think we've got had a really good discussion there on those issues.
I
The
think we
next
did. Yeah.
one, yes, the next one I wanted to talk about was just education.
Hmm.
So I'm talking primarily here about uh, tertiary education. So it's interesting. You often hear people say women are more educated than men. I absolutely wince every time I hear anybody say that, and I hear the people in the media say it
Right. Yeah.
quite a lot. Yeah,
Well,
yeah. So
is it proper to say that they're more well indoctrinated than men?
might be more accurate.
Yeah.
I think there are a couple of problems with this argument, setting aside the need for tertiary education at all, but uh, they basically just count the number of years of formal education and measure and use that formal schooling rather, and use that as a measure of education. A couple of problems with that. Firstly, it assumes that all forms of tertiary education are equally valuable, And the truth is, an engineering degree is a lot more valuable both to the individual and society than a gender studies degree.
Yes. Yes.
But yeah, but in addition to that, it tends to negate informal education. It also tends to negate things like apprenticeships and so forth too, but it tends to negate informal education. So I really disagree with the claim that women are more educated than men today.
Yep.
And my belief, and I've talked about this a little bit, but I probably never laid it all out like this, I think. But my belief is that I think men are just being more nimble with their education. I
Mm-hmm.
think the university system has really declined. I graduated in the 90s, and I think probably university education was probably quite valuable then, but for various reasons, there's been a significant amount of decline in quality of university education. And of course, in the meantime, the cost has gone up as well. And I think men are just being more nimble, and a lot of them are seeing the problems, and they are choosing alternatives. So it is no doubt. There's no doubt that the system, the university system, is hostile to men. Right?
Mm-hmm.
I'm not discounting that at all, but at the same time, I think men are largely disengaging from the university system.
Mm-hmm.
And finding alternatives. There are there's a lot of other avenues for training. If you're looking at IT, for example, and there are apprenticeships, and there's all sorts of other areas you can go into. Meanwhile, I think the women are continuing to do what kind of work did a generation ago, and go to university and get your degree and walk out with $100,000 debt. And and we see a lot of women complaining that they've got this degree and they were told if they got the degree they get a good job, and that's maybe 25 years ago, maybe it worked like that, but
Mm-hmm.
I don't think it works that way anymore. And so I'm not that concerned about men leaving university in large numbers because I think
Mm-hmm.
they're doing it. I think they're making the rational choices and finding alternatives. But
Absolutely.
it's not to discount that there are biases against men in the university system,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
but I think a lot of them are choosing alternatives. Yeah.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yep.
I mean, a related area, I guess, is they talk about the boys trailing girls in in education and reading and so forth. But we know, for example, that female teachers mark down boys. That's
Mm-hmm.
been shown since the first data came out about 15 or 20 years ago.
Yep.
The research has shown that to be has been true all around the world.
Mm-hmm.
And there's even some research that suggests that when you remove that bias, when you say computer mark the work, a lot of the apparent differences actually go away. So
Yeah.
that's not to say they fully go away, but I don't think I mean there are still problems there, and there's the problems with boys disengaging from education.
Mm-hmm.
But it does seem like to a large degree a lot of them innovating, I think, and finding their own way in life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And it's not like the grading system, be it tertiary or primary, is horribly reliable anyway. It's
Mm.
like some people learn at
Yes,
different
I agree.
speeds, to be sure. Yeah. 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 So it's not like one size fits all, or else you're an idiot. It's
Mm,
like
mm.
it's basically uh
And it is quite subjective, actually, especially in
mhm,
the humanities. I did a science degree, but I did a few humanities
yeah.
subjects. My degree allowed me to do some humanities subjects,
Hmm.
and I did them in. It was interesting to see the difference between the type of even within the physical sciences. There's some latitude there
Yeah.
for subjectivity, but
Yeah.
in the humanities, it's
Hmm.
very subjective.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know for a fact in at least one course I took a position on a paper that the lecturer didn't like, and I'm quite certain the lecturer marked me. Just look, I found the paper recently, a couple of years ago, actually, and this is sort of 25 years ago. And looking it over, you could see the lecturer had made all these comments about my position, and
Yep.
it was pretty clear I'd been marked down because they didn't agree with my position.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, sure. Like there was a philosophy course I took in college, and I still got a B on that thing. Like an 80, kind of like a B-ish kind of grade. But I still think I wrote it pretty darn well. But I was only kind of marked that because I took the position against Plato and in favor of Aristotle. Basically, kind of like the question of functions and form, which came first, kind of a thing. I took the side against the essentialist position of uh, uh, function, like form following. It's kind of a weird, it comes from an idea and then it becomes a form. I kind of took
Yeah,
the reverse position. So
this
yeah.
is the Greek idea that sort of there are perfect objects and they're
Hmm.
reflected imperfectly in the world. Yeah. Yes,
Right. Yeah.
yes.
Yeah. Sure. Yeah. I took the position against that, and
Okay.
yeah. Yeah.
And
But
they didn't like that.
yeah, sure, I don't know. Maybe it's just sour grapes for me. I think. But I thought I wrote that paper correctly, very well.
Yes.
I think I made my case pretty good.
You
I can't be sure, but I'm just.
Yeah, so same in my case. Although in my case, because I could see the comments and everything, and other things he'd said, I think it was pretty. But you ought to be marked on the quality of your work, not on the position you're expressing. But it does seem, if you and I both had that experience in the humanities, maybe that's a fairly
I
common.
suspect it was what it was. Yeah. Sure. Yeah.
Yes, that's right.
But but
Yes,
but in a non-STEM kind of a thing, like you could write very well and bullshit your entire argument and still probably do okay. You know,
yeah, yeah.
yeah.
Well,
So
we certainly saw that with some with the 20 or so papers that three academics generated and submitted to various journals in the soft sciences, the humanities, and they were well, one of them was taken from a chapter of Mein Kampf, and one you recall that? Yeah, there were three academics a few years ago. The three academics, they produced about 20 papers and they submitted them to various journals, and there were various forms of word salad, or they were taken from things like Mein Kampf.
Mhm.
And one of them referred to rape culture in the dog park, for example.
Yeah, I think that was the grievance studies. Was that? Yeah, is that
That
what it
might be
was?
right. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
So
yeah.
now I think now out of it, seven of them were accepted. I think somewhere around seven were accepted, but another seven were under consideration, and I think six had been rejected or something like that.
Mhm.
And but another seven were under consideration when somebody leaked what had happened, and they were of course all rejected at that point. But so seven were accepted, and there could have been as many as 14 that were accepted. And for anyone who hasn't read about that, go back a few years. I think we've certainly got stuff on Voice for Men. I think there might be stuff on Wiki for
Yeah,
Men too about it. And absolutely look at it. It's absolutely hilarious.
right.
But
Yeah.
yeah, I love the chapter of Mein Kampf being accepted.
Yeah,
Yeah.
well, besides the SJW dialogue, like a lot of the politics of the woke side, the SJW progressive side, resemble National Socialism anyway. So yeah,
Yes, exactly. That's right.
yeah, of course
Yes.
I'll pass for sure. Yeah.
Yes, the academics actually they tried to pursue them on it for academic fraud, but of
Hmm.
course it wasn't a case of academic fraud. They'd done this deliberately to reveal the
Yes,
problems in the
exactly.
system,
Right.
but of
Yeah.
course the system didn't like that at all. I have to find out what the latest the last time I looked at it, they were still under investigation. I think actually, so I have to
Hmm.
find out what happened. But yes,
Yeah.
it was well worth looking at if you haven't seen it
Hmm.
before.
Right. Absolutely.
So I think that's all I had on education.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes, yes. Oh, there was one last point I wanted to actually say because I've actually found even in my personal life some people misunderstood my position on this, and I'm going
Okay.
to I'm going to say it and put it on the video. So I have a position on university. Okay,
All
so
right.
I am quite critical of university today,
Yeah.
but at no time have I said don't go to university. Okay, because in some cases it is necessary. As in, if you're doing a law degree, it's all but essential. There are actually ways of getting law degrees without going to university, but it's hardly used these days. Almost
Okay.
everyone gets a degree at university. Doctor medicine, for example, you have to go to university, and there are other cases where it will be beneficial. So here's my position on universities. So work out what you want to do. If you're a young person, for example,
Mhm.
does it require going to university? If it does, then go. Otherwise, don't. That's my position.
Yeah.
And a lot of people have really misunderstood that. So I want to emphasize that. I'm not
Okay.
saying don't go to university. I'm saying, does your life path, your plan require you to go? If it
Hmm.
does,
Right.
or maybe it's not even a requirement, maybe it's highly beneficial, right? Fine. Go. But don't go just because. Don't go because it's what everybody else does, and don't go
Yeah.
because it's what's expected of you. Go if it
Exactly.
makes.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah, that's all I'm saying about it.
Sure. Yeah. This sounds like a good message for parents because a lot of them will probably be like thinking that the default, if you want your kid to have like a good life is, well, you got to go to college. You got to go to
Exactly.
university.
Bingo.
So
That's it.
exactly.
And in actual fact, if anybody's out there as a parent and they're in their 30s or 40s or 50s or whatever it happens to be, and you're thinking along those lines, and you haven't done so already, take a good hard look at tertiary education in the 2020s. You may be shocked at what you find. It's very different than if you're from an older generation and you went previously. So I think a lot of those people probably aren't aware of what's been going on or don't see how serious the problems have been there.
Right.
So to a large degree, I think a lot of men are already making the right choice and going and finding alternatives. Perhaps they go to university later on. That's another option too, because people who are older tend to be less influenced by the sort of BS that goes on at university. They've got a bit of life experience. The real problem is the 17, 18-year-olds going in, and they're a bit naive, particularly these days, and they get
Yeah,
influenced.
there's less pressure for the people who come in like later on to kind of participate in the stupidities of college
Yes,
life, you know, like
yes.
really stupid activities about diversity, inclusion, and being a global citizen and whatnot. And they kind of, you know, I kind of envied some of the people in like my 7 p.m. classes back in college, because you know they were on a school of much older people that come in for like a class or two or something like that. Yeah, yeah,
And
and
you're absolutely right. When I did my degree, it was the same. There were late night classes, and we could go in. I was doing mine as a young person, and that we could sometimes go in those classes too. And you're right. There'd be a lot of what we called mature age students, people who essentially had gone to university later. And the universities know. I looked at this going back a fair way now, but mature age students, people who go when they're older, have a much higher retention rate. They're actually much more likely to end up finishing their degree, and they tend to be more focused, all sorts of things. I
mhm,
think that's why the universities actually quite like them, because they tend to go
yeah,
in and they yeah. Whereas a lot of people, a lot of younger people actually drop out or change degrees, do
yeah,
all sorts of things. Yeah.
yeah.
But older people, they are very focused
Yeah, well,
when they're
seriously,
young.
like how is anyone really supposed to know what their degree is, even at like late teens? Like
Yeah.
maybe some do, who knows? But
Yeah. Yeah.
I think
A lot of
most
people
fall under
don't.
pressure. Yeah, right. Like,
Yes, and a lot of people, that's right, they may enroll in something and realize that it's not what they want to do. I mean, I did that. I started in physics, maths,
mhm,
and I realized after first year that I actually enjoyed watching and reading about other people doing physics more than I enjoyed doing it myself.
got it.
And I
Yeah,
ended up going into computer science and mathematics. So,
yeah,
yeah, so
yeah,
it's probably pretty common. For, as you said, they're only young people, and haven't got a lot of life experience in most cases, and we're expecting them to make these decisions that could affect their life, if not forever, for a long time.
you're right. I went into computer science, but without really knowing what I wanted to do. I actually didn't know what programming was when I took the major.
Okay, right.
Well, not that I didn't know. It's just like I
Yeah.
didn't know like the ins and outs and stuff like that.
Yeah,
Now,
yeah,
after a bunch of C grades, I finally started picking it up. But of course, I got those C grades in my history. Um, uh, I didn't understand discrete mathematics until I was applying them, and so I had to get a D in a discrete mathematics course once, then apply discrete mathematics in a different course and understood it, and then retake the discrete mathematics course
yeah. And you
and
would
get a
have
better
done you
grade on
would have
that.
done well the second time around, no doubt.
The second time around, yes, I did much better because I actually started
Yeah,
understanding it because I applied the stupid thing. Yeah,
yeah,
so you know, yeah,
yeah.
and
That's
and
that's very
yeah,
much mathematics all over, actually. That's
mm,
right. Each stage is built up on the one before it, and one when you're learning something, you often solidify
right,
the
yeah,
previous stages in your mind, absolutely, because you've
right.
now got to use them as a grounding for the stuff you're doing now. You have to understand them for
Right,
all the
sure,
stuff you're
yeah,
doing.
yeah. But the point I'm trying to make is that you've got those grades on your records for your past failures, which I don't know how that's going to affect you, in any negative
Yeah.
way, whatever. Sure, yeah. Also, one regret I have is that I knew that I'm not going to make money making music because I'm stubborn and I'm absolutely want to do the music I want. It's
Yeah.
probably not going to sell, but I don't care. But I should have minored in music, and it was too late for me to have done it by the time I realized that.
Right. Okay. Which is comes back to what we were saying, that when you're younger, we're expected to make these choices, and it's
Mhm.
probably not the best time in life to be making those sort of choices.
Exactly. Yep. Yep.
Yes.
Exactly. Yes. Yes.
So, but at least you're doing your music, and there can be something about doing it as a
Yeah.
hobby, because you're completely free, as you say, to do
Right.
what you want to do.
Well, uh, let's just say it's more than a hobby. It's more passionate than
Okay.
that. But
Okay. Fair
I get
enough.
what you mean. But
Yes.
I take my music like I'm gonna be serious about my music. It's not just something I can just forget. You know,
Yes, fair enough.
like I can't do that. Like I see a lot of my friends kind of forget about it. You know, that
Right.
I've grown up like listening to music and promising ourselves we do this kind of thing. I'm still doing it. You know,
Yeah.
even if I'm working alone. You know, and
So
also I'm a programmer by profession. So you
yeah,
know, I do a lot of database stuff. So you know, I was a C student, but I'm doing all right. I'm
yeah.
living quite all right. You know.
Yep, it's a good area to be in. In fact, which I think I have mentioned this before, but another thing I'll be doing more at a Voice for Men, and I've been doing quite a lot of work in the background. It may not seem like it at the moment, but I'm writing a couple of articles that have turned out to be quite long to taken quite a while. But also I'm prepping some work in the background related to IT, where I'm actually basically going to be encouraging men who have had a hard time in the system and they're a bit perhaps down on their luck
Mhm.
to maybe look at IT as an area because there is a lot really if you can school up in certain areas there's a lot of work out there and there's a lot of places and there's a lot of other jobs that it would be beneficial to know this stuff even if you're not necessarily working in IT just knowing
Yep.
some of this stuff having a big conversant with it will help you and that is something I've already started putting information on Wiki for Men and there'll be a lot more information put there. Yeah, I'm encouraging men to look at this as perhaps a second career or an area where if they've got a bit of time to skill up and benefit down the road from this information. So, yeah, just going back to that, I think that it's an important area, and even for people not in IT. It's still good to know this stuff. To
Mhm.
be a little bit deeper with it, be a little bit deeper than being able to just use Word or whatever it happens to be. I'm talking about
Oh yeah, yeah.
networking, understanding networking, and understanding operating systems and other stuff. So and coding. So yeah, this is an area that at a Voice for Men we will be encouraging more down the road.
Yep. Absolutely.
So wow, I think we've talked about quite a lot.
Yeah, sure. We're past the hour mark, aren't we?
Yes.
Yep.
All right. Well, I guess I'll see you in 2 weeks unless anything else. Oh, before we
Oh
go,
yeah, Zoe.
exactly. There we go. Right. So, as of April 2024, a warrant is outstanding for the arrest of Zoe McClellan in relation to charges of kidnapping, child stealing, and child custody deprivation. McClellan was reportedly residing in an apartment in River Ridge, Louisiana in April 2021. McClellan has a wealthy family in Louisiana and may still be residing there. Prior to disappearing, McClellan was known to use the alias Sarah Chandler. Anyone with relevant information should contact the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office. And we're going to keep saying this until McClellan is found and this matter is put before a court and judged appropriately. Thank you very much.
Yep. Thanks. Catch you later.
Thanks. Bye-bye. Bye.
Bye.